Namaste. Welcome to Treepole's Cooperative Podcast, the cooperative voice of the Southeast. We're bringing our community to the world and the world to our community. I'm Jay, and this week we are joined by the beautiful and talented Nancy Perez, who is the owner of Life Cope, and we'll be talking about her life story. We'll be talking about some Mexican history. We'll be discussing some Afro Mexican history and some strategies, empowerment strategies for people of color. So, welcome you guys. Let's get right into it. Go on and introduce yourself to the community, if you will.
Yeah, so my name is Nancy Perez, and like you said, I'm from Life Cope. I have my own podcast, and it deals with a lot of self-help, but I've also had a chance to meet a lot of awesome community members through that, incredible, inspirational women. And so that's a little bit of what I do. I also work for a coalition of nonprofits, so I'm constantly in the community just trying to be a liaison and be a resource. But my story doesn't start there. I am from Mexico. I came when I was 10. And it's not a story that I like to tell often, but I think it's a story that it's important to tell, especially with what's happening at the border and what continues to happen to people that look like me. And, you know, here I sit with no accent talking to you, but when I came across the border, walking through the desert, you know, without documents. And that was really rough because I was 10 and your parents are making that decision for you. And you don't really know what's happening. It's just you're being uprooted from everything you've ever known. And so there was just this big period of just being really angry at not understanding the change of environment. The food tasted horrible. Everything smelled weird. Like the school system was so odd to me. But I had a work to do, right? So right away I had to learn English. I had to start translating for my parents. I had to start becoming an adult. So I really missed out on some childhood. And that was really rough. But I think it gave me sort of that foundation as to why I do what I do now in the community and why I'm out here doing things for youth and trying to make a difference and an impact in our communities. It's because of that 10-year-old girl, right? It's because of that child that needed all of these resources and things that now I'm trying to work so hard to have available for others. And so growing up in Texas, you know, Americanization, it was do or die kind of a thing. And I had to lose my accent. I had to just, you know, I talked like a Valley girl when I was in high school. It was pretty sick to see the level of the lengths I would go to fit in as a teenager, you know, to fit into the status quo. I used to straighten my hair because I felt like I had to, versus now I feel like I choose to. And so for me, this journey was with that 10-year-old girl in mind, right? With that history in mind of like, that's where I come from, you know, and I let go of so much of that to fit in and to have opportunity, which is what I considered at the time necessary. And nowadays, it's not as necessary, which I'm so forever grateful for that. But even understanding the history that comes with that, like you said, we'll be talking about it a little bit later, but I didn't even understand the history of people of color fighting in this country. I was just trying to fit in. I wasn't worried about understanding what people in this country had already, as an immigrant. Like, that was, assimilation was the only thing that was like at the forefront of my mind. And, you know, I was never Mexican enough for the Mexican kids, right? Because to them, I was letting go of my culture, trying to be white. And then for the white kids, I was never going to be like them. I was never going to, you know, my lifestyle was never going to be like theirs. So that was really rough. It put me in this really weird space where I found commonality with just different people that felt like the outcast, right? Like, you know, like the kid who happens to be black but loves books. And that was who I found friendship in. Or, my best friend, a first generation Chicana, but really doesn't know how to be Mexican enough or American enough, and she's very white passing, so automatically the category she gets put in. So all of these things was really hard as a teenager to not have a place to where I belong to. So my 20s were really, the first 6 years of my 20s were really telling, because I was just pissed. I was just angry at the world because I never really been myself. Like, I had always just pretended to be whatever was necessary to survive. And I feel like a lot of people might resonate with that, might resonate with that idea of just trying to fit in. And as an immigrant, I think that I can really speak from that perspective. But even if you're just a kid that is into something that is nerdy, now you have to pretend to, like X, Y, and Z for your friends to not make fun of you, right? So it's like we all can identify with just trying to fit in to whatever it is, but it's so much harder when you have those pressures of just being a teenager, and then also the cultural aspects of it and the expectations from family and la cultura, like, what the culture does to us sometimes too, and I see it across the plethora of like just people of color. It's not just a Mexican issue. It's not just a Black issue. It's an issue across the board, because we're trying to basically assimilate to a system that is not really created for us. But here we are, right? Still being resilient, still trying to push forward in our journeys and however we can. So my story is that of that 10-year-old girl. Like, even though it's 3 decades later, my life could not be polar opposite. I go hiking in the mountains for fun, and I've gone to Canada to do it for leisure. And it's always so impactful. I wrote a poem when I went to Canada, because it's like, how does this brown girl that walked across the freaking desert now legally got her passport stamped at the other side of the border, on the other end? And that was full circle for me. That was like, shit, like, there is a place for everyone. And if you're sitting at home thinking that there's not a place for you in this world, you just gotta go find it. It's there. It's always been there. Like, for me, it's so funny that my place was the place that I fear the most, right? Like, I fear the outside with, 10 years old, that's pretty traumatic. The least would ruffle, and I was scared. And to find my place in nature, to find that healing, there was just like, so for me, that's kind of where my story really came full circle for me, was, going across the Canadian border, getting my Mexican passport stamp and my green card, verified, all that fun stuff, and just, realizing that, yes, I had to pay $10,000 for that little card, because that's what it costs, lawyers and fees and all this stuff. But it gave me, more than anything, it gave me just realization, right? Realization that this whole journey up until that point was a journey for others, never truly for me. And so for the first time in my life, I have lived in my truth, in my full essence. And that has allowed me to just come into myself in a way that I didn't think it was even possible, to find healing from within, that I think that as people of color, we all need that, and so my story is all encompassing, it's forever changing, but that period from 10 to 26 really it was just decision after decision that led me to where I am today as a woman, and that led me to this point of just realization and just complete and total awareness of, where I've been and where I'm seeking to go. And I think that if our stories can be even a little bit of that, and if we can collectively come together, I think that we can be such a force to be reckoned with. And I think that we can learn so much from one another's stories, because in some ways they mimic and they repeat themselves. I don't know what the African diaspora, might have felt. I can just share, and maybe you can, and it's just in that sharing and in that like coming together as people that I feel like our voices, our individual stories, and our greatness can really, really, truly shine.
So I definitely appreciate you sharing that with us. And I caught a lot of history even in your story. And I guess we can kind of segue right into talking about some Mexican history, which is something that I'm hoping that community, we begin to open our eyes and ears a little more to other folks' stories. Everybody's got a past and a history and a destiny. And what we want to do is start celebrating that and elevating those voices so that we can become more conscious and aware of some of those parallels that we all have to each other. So I'll let you jump right into that.
Absolutely. And so, like I mentioned, in the earlier segments, I had to do some digging to find connection to culture, because the reality is that Mexico culture was no longer my culture, in the sense that the way of life there, what they were listening to, what was popular was not it. So I needed to look at the history of what, Mexican people had done, in the United States, because as someone who didn't sound like had an accent, all of these things, people just automatically assumed that I was a Chicana, right? And I didn't know anything about it. So, looking at the civil rights movement, it's the parallels of the time frames and the strategies are almost so identical. And I didn't know that. No book taught me that in school. Like, no one even verbally ever said that these weren't just completely different time periods, that they were really coincided. Like, the agriculture movement started a little bit sooner, but I mean, they were just like one with the other. And locally in Denver, there was, I don't want to butcher his name, but there was Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, and he's the founder of the Crusade for Justice. And that was like, for the Chicano movement, Denver was like a pivotal area. San Antonio, which was like 2.5 hours from Texas. All of this history that like you can't really find it at a museum. Now you see like Pueblo, the college, they're doing these exhibitions. But this is like me in my early 20s. Like all I had really was the internet and YouTube. And so I found some documentaries through that. And that's when I first heard, Mexicans like organizing, right? Around some of the agriculture issues, but also around just like wanting to be seen as people, not just as labor force, not just as another number. And so through some of that crusading, community really came together for the first time. And so in Denver, the Crusade for Justice, they created this community hub, and literally every community member, it was like a cooperative, they put in for it. It was, they owned it outright, and they started teaching the kids how they should be taught. All of a sudden, the literacy rates went up. All of a sudden, like, the kids were being educated. All of a sudden, you had people moving from rural areas where they were just campesinos, just like farm workers, to now moving into the cities. So Los Angeles saw a huge influx of that. Denver saw a huge influx of that. San Antonio saw a huge influx of that. And these were just like big pockets throughout the United States that saw just, Mexican Americans moving in groves to the cities looking for work, because migrant work was limited. And two, they were doing advertising and paying people to come across the border illegally to work the land. So that's why sometimes you see some of the immigrant and like Chicano divide, is because of some of those like racial tensions that happened back then, because corporations had money to make. So they didn't care who was doing the labor. And if they could pay, a Mexican farm worker that just came across the border pennies on the dollar, well, that's what they were going to do. And for the Mexican worker, for the immigrant, it was like an opportunity. They saw it as an opportunity, not as I'm taking something from my brother and sister, which essentially is what was happening. But all in the name of capitalism at the end of the day, right? We need cheap fruits and vegetables, and that means that we need cheap labor, and that's being a little cynical, but that's the reality, right? So looking throughout history, it doesn't look a lot different than what we're seeing. It's just evolved, right? Just like they had their suffrage and the things that they were dealing with, it created divide amongst the community itself. So now you had first generation, Chicano Americans that were like angry at the, undocumented immigrant worker that was coming across. I didn't understand any of that until I went and searched it and researched it. So for you that is listening or watching this, like, go research, because sometimes there's divides even among your community that you don't understand where they're coming from. And literally, like, this is decades and decades and decades of this stuff happening. And here we are sort of still trying to repair the broken relationships that have happened because of the system that we live in, a system that was not created for us.
So, I definitely appreciate that history. I'm a big history buff, and especially when it comes to the history of where the African diaspora has been. And one of the meaningful stories in that history is Afro Mexican history.
Yeah.
And so I definitely want to refer you guys to a good docuseries. It's called Black in Latin America. So you want to check that out. And the other book I want to refer you guys to is They Came Before Columbus, which is a really good read to get a little more in-depth history of that Afro-Mexican journey. And so that kind of me starting to understand that history as an adult opened my eyes to a lot of parallels between African American history and Mexican American history, and also just broaden my vision and perspective of what I feel people of color or melanated people around the world could be working on, right? A lot of times we in community jump in with your comments here. I think a lot of times because we don't get a wide-ranging history, because we don't get the whole story, because we get history as the people in charge want us to know, we become very ignorant and we become very hard of heart towards one another. And when in reality we have much shared culture and history that we could be looking into and finding opportunities to collaborate based on that understanding that before someone told us not to work together, we were working together. And so that's one of those stories along the journey of the African diaspora that really informs my understanding today of what people of color could and should be doing. So that being said, community, one of the things that I'd like to suggest that we start looking more into for an example of, what can we do with that history after we get that, feel good history. Oh yeah, hey, our people work together. So here's a practical example of what we can start doing based on new understandings and building new understandings of our relationships to each other. Solidarity economics, right? So that concept of solidarity economics between cultural groups and letting that be kind of a door opener for the cultural exchange and cultural diffusion and other solidarity actions. That's something that I would suggest that we start looking into sooner than later. I think it'd be definitely very helpful for those folks who want to practice that. So let me be straight up with you. There's going to be some folks that are not with that. That's fine. That's them. Let them do them. If that's you, no judgment, but that's you. And for folks who are interested in working together and bridging gaps and building bridges, I gave you some references and also gave a suggestion, and we can talk about that as a community and see like what that might look like. So I'm going to pass the mic back to you and just kind of let you speak on that whole connection thing.
Yeah, so first of all, we could not be more connected as people. Like, you're breathing in the air that I'm breathing out, right? Like, we have to make that connection as humans first. And then I think that, the cultural references and the cultural connections are important to realize that we've been here and we've been connected before, but it's not all so rosy. In Mexico, we have a lot of colorism, right? And not only in Mexico, throughout the United States, I see it, in communities all the time. We have colorism. So for someone to, say that they're African in Mexico or that they're Afro Mexicanos, it's not something that is common. And there's a reason for that, though. A lot of people thought it was because they were being excluded or anything like that. And the documentary shows some of, what's happened throughout history. I really highly recommend you watch that episode. It's episode 4. And it is one of those things that people don't want to address. But it also has to be addressed that the people that were fighting these wars for liberation, they were part black. And that's a part of Afro Mexican history that we don't accept, that they were part black. So when they wrote what is essentially like the Constitution or the Bill of Rights here, they basically said all people born in this land are just Mexican. And the reason for that is because they knew what the cultural breakdowns did for them, right? Because they were more melanated, because they were part African, because back in those days, like, slave ships were coming in just as more to the Veracruz, port ship than they were coming, to the South port ships in the South of the United States. So that's the reality that, like, Black history and slavery and all of these things, it's world history, and it's a painful history to accept as to why some of these things have happened, but also to realize that the fight for Afro-Mexicanos to be acknowledged is only a recent one. But that's not because they were being excluded. That's because the people leading the fight used to look like them. But books were whitewashed. History was whitewashed. And so the division started, like, from the minute that the Spanish settled in. I mean, they had these systems, like, I'm Native and I have Spanish and I have some Middle Eastern and some Black and all this, because now we have the technology to find out what's within us. But back then they would just be like, okay, your mom is this, your dad is that, you're a mestizo, you're this, you're that, and that literally placed your kind of place in society. And so the people that freed themselves from that look like you and I. There was no reason to say, Latin Mexican and, Afro Mexican. There was no reason for that, because the people liberating and leading the way were people of color, were dark-skinned people. And so I think that we have to stop regarding our history as like some white savior came and fixed the day, because reality is that that's the history that we're being shown. That's not the true history, right? Just like with the African diaspora, like, that's not the first time African people were in this part of the continent if you look into the Moors, right? And so there's so many ways to get educated where it has its levels. Sometimes I think it's just that inner self-acceptance. Like, I was very angry for a long time, and so understanding these concepts was not even where I needed to be at, the focus needed to be at. But now I think that these conversations are popping up more because people are continuing to try to divide and create more division amongst people of color. So I think the more that we can say, no, there was no need to say Afro-Mexicano, because literally the people leading the way were Afro-Mexicanos, and they were just like, no, we're just Mexican. We just want to be Mexican like everybody else. And I think that that's what we're saying as people of color in this country. We just want to be people. We just want to be Americans. We don't want to be, I don't want to be a token of, or an example of what a good immigrant looks like, or what, a good assimilated person can achieve X, Y, and Z. So I think, like, if we as a community want to create change, lasting change, you have to go and do the work first to find your true self, because then you can come to the collective and say, this is what I have to bring to the table. Like, I know myself so well that these are the attributes that I know I can bring to the table. And like you mentioned, like, some things is not for everybody, and you can still root people on, and you can still be like, I see you, still trying to make a difference, but it's still about just doing something, caring about something, and that has to start with you. Like, you can't go out in the world caring for everything else if you're not caring about yourself first. So me caring about myself was me finding out my history. Me caring about myself was letting go of this anger and this generational baggage that I didn't even know I was carrying, right? I think a lot of times history can teach us that we've been carrying some of the same things our ancestors were carrying with them. So when do we say enough?
Appreciate that. You guys, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to discuss a little bit about the role of women in organizing strategies for the empowerment of people of color. And we're also going to learn where we can find Nancy on social media and a little bit more about how we can connect with her. So you guys stay tuned. We'll be right back. And thank you guys for staying with us. So I'm going to jump right into a little bit about my views on the role of women in empowerment strategies for people of color. And I feel like it's important to communicate these things from me to you as a member of the community. But I'm also encouraging us all to remember that these voices are more than worthy of elevating. The voices of women within our struggles, within our joys, our passions, our spirituality, every aspect of our lives, it is a worthwhile thing to elevate the voices of women in that. So for me, finding tons and tons and tons of meaningful ways that women have shaped our struggle against oppression, have shaped our cultural development, our ability to learn and grow, right? Whether that applies to smaller communities or larger civilizations. All of these things inform and impact my decision making, the way I'm willing to organize and strategize, the things that I'm interested in doing and not doing. And so I just wanted to make sure that that's not forgotten in all of what we're talking about, is the role of women in that Afro Mexican history, or in the journey of the Mexican people, or in the journey of Africans, the diaspora, as well as continental Africans. I want to make sure that we are all remembering to elevate those voices. So I'm going to pass that over to you.
And yes, I think that it is so important to recognize the role that women play. I think history books often will show you men at battle, right? But they won't show you like the role that women have played throughout history. And I think that as women of color, our role in history often gets downplayed. And again, I'm going to keep going back to, you can't be out in the community doing work unless you've done some inner self-reflectiveness. And so for me, I think that what I always come to is that we have to be megaphones, right? Like, I'm not going to be able to change the system, but I can be a megaphone for the particular intersections that I identified with, right? Where I identify, where I can speak to, what it is to be an undocumented immigrant, and then had to be a documented one, because that was a journey, right? But not only that, but as a woman, and what the culture did to me, my culture, right? Like, I married, I thought that I could only be straight, have a husband, have babies, like that's what the culture taught me. So sometimes, as women, we also have to recognize that sometimes we can love our culture, we can love our people, and recognize when that very thing we love has oppressed us. That very thing we love has made us made decisions because of what is expected of us. So I think as women who are watching or listening to this episode, is really, our job is not to take care of others or take care of the world or to be mothers to the world, but really is to be and to take care of ourselves first. Find out what it is that we love, and what we have natural joy, that natural joy that just spurs out of you and you just want to jump out of bed every day to go do that. Literally, that's what we need to do. And you see a lot of women who are depressed and angry and all of these things, and it is because of the status quo, but sometimes it's because we're trying to do things that are mandated of us, not that we really want to do. And for me, that's really the biggest journey one of being a woman in this body and what that means, and the fears that sometimes that come with that. And that's sad that I even have to have fears for existing in the body and in for having the body parts that I do. But the reality is that it's so much more deeper than that, right? Like for me, it was like the cultural obligation to be a mother. Like, I want to be a mother to hundreds of children, so I do nonprofit work with kids now, right? But I don't want to be like a physical carrier of a human life, but my culture doesn't recognize that as okay, right? It's almost like as a woman, there's something wrong there. And so there is this need to bring attention to these things. And sometimes my family in Mexico doesn't understand why I partake in things like the Women's March, because to them it's like, I have a maid, I traveled, I got a divorce, but they don't understand also like that them doing that is stigmatizing the fact that I chose different, right? And so for women listening, it's like, choose different, like continue to choose different, whatever that is. And culture can say one thing, family, religion, whatever it might be, but at the end of the day, if you're gonna die unhappy, then really, who did you liberate? What did you help liberate? So for me, like personal liberation, and then you can go out into the world and plant seeds, but really just be a megaphone for what you do know, right? I don't know what being anything else other than me is. And so that's all I can share out into the world. And I'm often trying to tap into others and say, hey, share with me. So if I've ever asked you, hey, share with me, please know that it has come from a place of wanting to learn and grow. And I have bumped heads with some community members because my approach is not always, the preferred one. But at the end of the day, I still see the work that community members are doing, and I see that it's true to who they are, and that makes me happy. And that makes me joyful for those of you that are already out there in the community doing amazing work, doing great things. Keep doing it. It doesn't have to be what I would do. It doesn't have to be what anybody else would do. But if it makes you happy, if it personally liberates you, then we are on the right path as women, because it's about taking that empowerment to do and be whatever that may be. And so whether it's as people of color, whether it's as women in this country, whether in the overall, we really have the power to lead the way, and we can lead by liberating ourselves and from every aspect that plagues our lives, and just being happy, healthy to the best of our ability. That doesn't mean that every day is going to be that. It just means that you're working towards that possibility.
All right. So, powerful conversation.
Yes.
Definitely more to be had. This will not be the end of that conversation. Community, we will be bringing you more content like this in the future. And if you want to support this content, you can do so by purchase, by donation, or by becoming a co-owner of Tree Post Cooperative. This is actually a cooperative community platform that you can co-own. And so we're going to leave it there for now. And as always, we'd like to remind you to think creatively, act cooperatively, and build community.